All right, we're all set.
Great.
So, welcome everyone. Sorry for the technical difficulties in the very beginning. I'm Max Johnson with Midcoast Council of Governments. And today,
I'm Nick Hodgkins. I'm sitting in for Chris Redmond. Chris unfortunately couldn't make it. He had a family emergency come up. So I'm pinch hitting for him. So that's the bad news. The good news is that up until 2 months ago, I was in his position and been in it for 30 years. So I know the program pretty well. So I'm not the 200 pinch hitter. I'm maybe a 300 pinch hitter. So what we're going to do today is just talk a little bit about some Brownfields 101. And we're going to start the slideshow here, I guess. I'll go through these pretty quickly. Want to have lots of time for Q&A. Unfortunately, I do have a deadline of 2 o'clock. I have to leave and get back to Augusta for a meeting. So luckily in my office, I had my Brownfields shirt. So I threw it on like a cape and came in just to represent today. So anyways, like I said, I'm Nick Hodgkins. I've been doing this for a long time, Brownfields, so this feels pretty comfy to me. So what are brownfields? Well, brownfield is the property, the expansion, redevelopment, or reuse of which may be complicated by the presence or potential presence of a hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant. So basically, one of the key things in there is potential presence, really. It doesn't necessarily need to be contaminated, but you may have reason to believe that it may be contaminated, and that pretty much sets you up to be a brownfields type property.
there we go.
There we go. Oops, you went a little one too far. So the Brownfields program is a federal program administered and funded by the U.S. EPA in the form of both grants and low interest loans. The loans are for cleanup. The Maine Department of Environmental Protection receives Brownfields funding annually. We use that for assessment and cleanup properties statewide. Often we fill in the gaps where we don't have grantees. So, a lot of folks go through competitive process, get grants. They kind of serve the area that they're in. And we kind of fill in those spots where maybe they don't have coverage, or sometimes the spots where a grantee may have some real focus properties that takes all their funding, but they have another good project, but don't really have the funding for it. We may jump in then and help with those too. We also like to do a couple small type cleanups every year. I will say that with the infrastructure law funding, we have more funding than we usually have. So right now, it's a pretty good time for us to push a lot of properties. I can't say what it will look like in the future, but now is a good time. I get about, well, right now, for doing assessment and or cleanup directly within our program, we have over $500,000. But our grantees have a lot of money. I will say that over the last 2 years, Maine has received more brownfields funding than any state in the country. And per capita, over time, we get far more funding than any other state per capita.
Sorry.
Nope. And municipalities, nonprofits are folks that are available for the brownfields funding. They have the competitive process that I talked about. Usually that's advertised sometime in the fall, usually September. 2 months from that, the applications will be due. We've had, like I said, a very high success rate in Maine. Part of the reason for that is most grantees or would-be grantees partner with our consultants who are very good at writing grants. Yep, and they do it generally pro bono. The hopes they'll get a job down the road. They receive the funding directly from EPA. So if Rockland has certainly received funding in the past, and they have funding right now for the Shafter's junkyard cleanup. They receive that directly from EPA. Our role as a state a lot of times is just kind of being the technical eyes, ears on the site. EPA is providing the funding. We're making sure that Rockland as a municipality is doing what it needs to do, crossing the T's, dotting the I's so that they don't get in trouble. Because, there are some places you can trip up in the process. There, like any federal money, it doesn't come, no strings attached. So. Yep. The Brownfields program, very public process. So if you wanted to participate in Brownfields, but you want to keep everything kind of low key and not be out there in the public, it's not the program for you. It's typically a longer process with a number of must-dos, just because there's certain thresholds, certain things that you have to do along the way. Again, that's the strings attached to that money, because someone's got to report on what you did with it. Grantees receive funding, have a process to solicit and evaluate project sites, and that's different for every grantee, how they decide to get that information, and how they determine the best way to contact and solicit that information from their communities, and provide those sites have to meet the eligibility criteria. So there are some sites that just do not fit. I think a good example would be actually here in Rockland. I'll use that as an example. Rockland had some schools, like all municipalities do. They owned them from start to finish, basically. They couldn't use their assessment funding to assess that because they were kind of a responsible party. If there are any problems there, they owned it, they created it. In those cases, another entity, say a council of governments that would serve this area, come in and do the assessment, or us at the Maine DEP come and do the assessment. So there are kind of ways to get around those issues as well. The Brownfields assessment process is pretty simple. You do a phase one. Phase one is really your paperwork research. So you follow what's called the ASTM standard, and that's an industry standard for what needs to be in these reports, what things you need to look at, etc. You look at all available information that you can find, such as tax maps, Sanborn insurance maps were great historically to find historic uses of properties, aerial photos, historical documents, geologic maps, municipal records, DEP and EPA spill reports and site lists. So you look to see not only what is at the property, but what might be next to the property. Certainly, if you were looking at a subject property that didn't really have any issues that you could find, but there was a Superfund hazardous waste site next door, you'd probably want to note that because it may be impacted by it. You do a site visit and walk over. That's a good way to ground truth what your research may have been telling you. And sometimes that's when you find that there is, in fact, something next door that you didn't know about. You interview the site owner and the past owners. Sometimes that's fruitful, sometimes it's not, but it's good to do. Some people are more honest than others when it comes to recalling things. You identified recognized environmental conditions, RECs. The RECs are very important. Those are the things that if you have a recognized environmental condition, an REC, those are the things that you are going to explore and assess in the next phase to see if they are problems or aren't problems. And at the end of it, you write this report, this phase one environmental assessment. Important thing about the phase one environmental assessment is if you do it as part of your due diligence before acquiring a property, it essentially kind of prevents, as long as you don't go out there and make a mess of your own, it kind of prevents CERCLA from, which is Superfund's waiting list, of putting you on that list. So it's kind of a good way to I guess, protect yourself against EPA CERCLA being too involved or too curious about your property. The second part is the phase two environmental site assessment. What you do from that is so you have your RECs that you got in phase one. Say if it's a gas station, or say it's a convenience store that has existed since maybe the 50s or 60s. You do your phase one research and you find, well, it's a convenience store today. you know, it has a gas pump out front selling gas, and it's selling, nacho chips with cheese all over them, and gas station pizza and stuff like that. But you start looking at the building and you realize there are two structures that have been all cinder blocked in that kind of look like they might have been garage bays at one time. You do your phase one research, you find out, yeah, it was a garage from the time it was built in 1950 until 1987, and it just became a convenience store. So from that, old garages may have had things like parts washers, hydraulic lifts, floor drains, dry wells, things like that that might cause other contaminant concerns besides the tanks out front that have the gasoline. So when you have those RECs from that, say it was an old service garage at one point, you have your things to look at. Well, when you develop your conceptual site model, you are looking at potential sources of contamination. So say that garage had hydraulic lifts. Sometimes those lifts had reservoirs with oil in them. Sometimes that oil was just hydraulic fluid, and sometimes it was waste oil that might have had PCBs and stuff like that in it. You might have what was a parts washer. You don't know where it went. Maybe it went down the drain. Maybe it went to a dry well. Maybe it was just dumped out the back door. So that's a potential source of contamination. And you have obviously the USTs or ASTs that are associated with the current tanks. And probably before that, you had past tanks that were in the ground. So you identify, the first thing you do in making a conceptual site model, which is going to guide how you assess a property, you identify those potential sources of contamination. Then you identify the potential receptors. So if this former garage service station is in downtown Rockland and everyone's served by public water, and you do a well survey, you don't find any wells nearby, probably people drinking the water aren't going to be a receptor. What about people on the site? Are they going to be receptors? Well, it depends. Is there contamination that's accessible? Do you have contamination right at the ground surface that people, digging the dirt, et cetera, might get into? Or is it dirty? Do you have dirty dirt down 8 feet where, say, someone digging a foundation or something in the property in the future runs into that? So how do you have receptors like that? Also, when you deal with a gas station, you deal with a lot of volatile organic contaminants. They give off vapors. The vapors are another thing that might get to people. So if you have receptors, people in the area working in the building, are there vapors in the building from a gasoline leak that are potential health impacts? So you look at those type of things. And the last part of conceptual site model is said, okay, we have a source here. We have a source, say a gas tank, and we have a house next door, a receptor that might be a receptor for vapors. So you're trying to see when you construct your phase two, when you're doing the actual work, collecting samples out there, you try to construct it to say, what are my sources? What are the receptors? And is the pathway to those receptors complete? Are those receptors likely to be impacted? So then you develop a site-specific quality assurance work plan, SSQAP as it's termed in Brownfields. It's basically just a work plan that says, this is what we're going to do to assess the property. Now, with the SSQAP, there are a lot of things you have to do to pass muster for brownfields and to get the federal money. So there are a number of things involved in that. That's why it takes a little longer. You need approvals from EPA and DEP. You need to have a lot of things in place. But you get through that process, you develop your work plan. You want to look at the contaminants of concern, the media to sample, so soil, air, groundwater, perhaps, those type of things. You want to figure out the quantity of samples. How many is enough? You want to collect enough samples to be able to make a decision in the end. You want to be able to make that decision on, do we need to do cleanup? Do we not need to do cleanup? How many samples that is, what type of samples those are really site specific. But generally you want to sample, you need to sample any media that you think may be impacted, that may cause a receptor to be. Yes. Yes. Except for those, we have full authority to approve any SS flaps that are done by our program. When we do the work, we can approve them ourselves. Yep. Yep. So by and large, the majority of sites, EPA has to approve the SS flap. That's the majority of the sites. No, it's generally pretty quick. We have a number of project managers, so they're assigned to, we assign our project managers to a grantee. So they're going to work with that grantee to do any of the, any of that part of the work. EPA has established for themselves, I think, a 30-day turnaround time for the SS scrap. They'll get it done quicker if they can, but they try to keep to a 30-day schedule. Well, what happens is the SS scrap is a site-specific quality assurance plan, so it deals specifically with a site. All of the contractors that work on these have to have an approved, EPA approved and Maine DEP approved generic quality assurance plan. That's the thing that has all the laboratory procedures, which are 10,000 pages of SOPs. And so that all basically is approved. So we say, yep, we approved your methods, we approved your lab, we approved this. Then the SS scrap basically says, yeah, we're going to use this method to collect this type of sample. It kind of condenses it all down. So, you have to look at the media of the sample, like I said. The quantity of the samples, how many do you need to take, and the quality data. Can you get can you assure that at the end of this you're going to have data that is of acceptable quality to make decisions? Sometimes, if you're doing screening on the site, that is a simpler thing. It's usually a yes/no, right? If you're screening and you have what's called a PID, a photoionization detector, tells you if something volatile is there. So you use that and you sniff some soil. It goes wild. Meter goes wild. The alarm goes off. You say, we got something. Maybe you don't know exactly what it is, but you have something. If you don't get anything on that, it just tells you, well, we don't have anything volatile. So there's certain screening that you do that has a lesser degree of quality assurance necessary for it. That data quality isn't as important. When you start collecting samples, you got to make sure that the lab's doing it, can do it, is approved to do it, knows how to do it, isn't going to give you a lot of things with a lot of questionable data. You want good data. So that is all. Those are all the reasons you put that SS scrap together in the first place. You want to make sure you have quality data that's defensible, that you can make decisions. And then you go ahead and collect those samples for lab analysis once you have your SS scrap approved. You send them to the lab. Hopefully, you bring them in to the lab with all the quality that needs to be. A lot of samples need to be a certain temperature. They have to be cool usually. You don't bring them in like 2 months from when you sample. They'll probably pass the analysis date. There's certain things as a sampler you're required to do. Once you get all that data back, that's when you put the report together. The report's basically saying, okay, we identified these RECs, these recognized environmental conditions, the things we were concerned about. We sampled all of those, and we sampled the pathways, migration. We sampled them for the contaminants that we were concerned with. What are you concerned with when you have gas pumps? Well, you're concerned with gasoline or diesel. So you make sure that you collected all you need to do. Maybe when the report's done, you say, well, we found some things and we need to get a little more data. You need to refine that data. Maybe you found over here something you didn't expect to find. So well, let's go out and see if that's real. And let's go out and see how large a problem it is. So that's what you really do in the phase 2 and or maybe a supplemental phase 2. There are, generally, we don't bump into them. There are competitive grants that can be site specific, you know, so sometimes you have a very large site specific grant that's only working on one site. And those are the big assessments, but most of the assessments, you know, some people will do, you know, 6 phase ones and 2 phase twos with their grant money, you know, and some will do 8 phase twos and 8 phase ones. So it kind of depends on the type of site that you bring in. And they're very, you can go as high as you can justify within what you get for a grant, you know. So some folks may spend all of their money on one site. Hopefully, you know, there'll be a bunch of sites, but sometimes, like I said, there's the site specific where you go for one site. That's always a good route too when you have a good site. So the brownfields process, the remediation phase, you need to evaluate the pros and cons associated with different cleanup options. And that's called an analysis of brownfields cleanup alternatives, ABCA. Basically, that's saying, okay, how much is it got? What are the problems? How do we best address them? How do we address the risks? You know, so what are the risks to the receptors? How do we address those? What's the cost of each option? What are the how implementable is it? Can you do it? Is it easy to do, or is it going to be really tough? A lot of times now they're looking at things like how climate resilient is it? You know, if you're doing some work along the waterfront, along the river, along the ocean front, they're going to look at that. You know, is the remedy durable? You know, or are you going to have problems? I always say I always tell people I don't get into the part of whether you believe in it, that climate change was caused by man or not. If your parking lot is under the water, it really doesn't matter. You know, and I know in Dharmascotta, they did some assessment down there a few years ago because they were starting to have water coming up in the Maine municipal parking lot behind the downtown. So it doesn't matter what the cause is. When you have water in your parking lot, it's a problem. So they look at that, look at some other issues, but generally the idea is to find the best solution that best addresses the risks at the best cost. So that's what the whole ABCA process is about. It's a public process. They put the draft out there for 30 days for public comment. They also have to have a public meeting during that to discuss it, you know, and there's questions or anything. And from that, they choose the cleanup method they think is best. Sometimes you also have to think about what the end use of the property is. And usually when you do this, you know what it is going to be. So you may get some efficiencies by choosing a remedial approach that is also perhaps going to help the redevelopment of the property. You know, caps, covers, things like that. Then you go ahead and you implement that cleanup. Once you've decided what the best method to clean it up is, you implement the cleanup. And at the end, they submit a remedial action completion report. So those are all things too that EPA wants. Now, a lot of the terminology here is about EPA. They want to have a project at the end that they can put a ribbon on. So, yes, use for space. EPA doesn't really sign off. They kind of leave that to the states. And yes, we do risk-based corrective action in Maine, and what it generally means for anyone in the audience that isn't familiar with that. Risk-based corrective action is cleaning up to a certain level, certain criteria based on the proposed reuse of the property. So obviously, if you have a residential property where people are living there 24/7, 365 days a year, that is a site that we will probably have more stringent cleanup standards for. If it's an industrial property, we're likely to have cleanup levels that are a bit higher. So there's more tolerance for that. Also, what usually goes with cleanups, and I'll get into this a little more, is deed restrictions on property. So, and a lot of those deed restrictions are what I call no-brainers, but we'll get into that here a little more. Right. Right. What happens is not necessarily. Depends on if it's going to be in the voluntary remedial action program, the VRAP program, voluntary cleanup program, and if you have off-site impacts, that's what really triggers it. You know, if everything is on the property, we're not as concerned. You know, right. Yes. Yep. So again, continuing on the remediation phase, you identify receptors that are impacted above the established risk-based guidance for the appropriate exposure scenario. So we just talked about that. Is it industrial? Is it park user? Is it residential? Someone going to have a daycare there, or someone going to have, you know, a Walmart there? Those are all things that we think about. Determine how to reduce risk to acceptable level. You know, so you can do removal remediation, muck and truck, or you might just dig stuff out and take it off to an appropriate disposal facility. You might use different types of remedial. There are a lot of technologies out there for remediation for different kinds of things. You might use some of those to just clean it up to the guidance level. You might implement engineering controls to reduce risk. So in the case of, like, say, our gas station that used to be a service station, if there are vapors there, there might be a risk from those vapors. You might put in a sub-slab depressurization system that takes those vapors out and away from the building, so people inside aren't breathing that. You may have a cap cover of contaminated materials that's engineered. And usually, quite often, we place some deed restrictions on the property that limit exposure and reduce risk. So as I talked about before, if you had something in Rockland where everyone's on public water, say that you do a well survey in the area, fine, no private wells, that's the type of place we could say, well, you know, yeah, groundwater is impacted some above our guidance, but no one's drinking it. And we'll put what I call the no-brainer deed restriction on it. We're going to say, you're not going to put in a well for potable uses. So we try to put on deed restrictions that are pretty easy for people to follow and make sense. You know, sometimes people want to go for bigger, more sophisticated type deed controls. Those are good, but they have their limitations. They have their, they can be cumbersome. So. We have in some of ours, it depends on the site, and it's very site specific, but we have a number of sites that have deed restrictions where they are required to report to us in some amount of time. Sometimes it's 1 year, sometimes it's 5 years, sometimes it's, you know, 1 year for 3 years, and then once every 5 years, something like that. We have that built in, not on all of them by any means. Some of them are just kind of self-performing. We don't feel the risks are very big. We have a lot of small potato sites, I'll call them, and we might not have that built into them. We do usually reserve the right to go and inspect anytime, make sure that the restrictions are being followed, and we do audit a number of our sites. We've audited probably now 400 of our sites or so. We've had about 1,200 times, so we try to do that. The biggest thing that people fail to do is a lot of times file their VRAP and file their deed restrictions, but they're otherwise in compliance. So that's the good thing. Brownfields process certification. So many brownfield sites also participate in DEP's Voluntary Response Action Program, VRAP, to receive liability protections. So VRAP is a voluntary program where folks apply to the program, pay our application fee, and we review the reports. So when we're doing brownfields, we're reviewing the reports anyways. And basically, if when someone cleans up or remediates the site to commissioner's satisfaction, as defined in the law, they will receive protections from liability. So that's obviously very attractive to a lot of folks, especially a lot of folks participate in VRAP because their lenders won't let them do otherwise. You know, a lot of people will come to me and say, "We need a VRAP." I said, "Okay, why?" Because our bank told us to. So, but it is a good thing to do. Yeah, it's a check on the checkbox. We got a VRAP, but it's a good thing to do. It goes hand in hand with brownfields. I will tell you that EPA brownfields wants to have some part of the state generally signing off on these and doing that. So they really like it when they participate in VRAP. Most brownfields we've had participate in VRAP. Some do not, and there's sometimes other programs that can kind of say, "Yeah, they did what they need to do, and we're done." Those other programs do not provide the liability protections, so that's the bonus of a VRAP. So.
Most of the voluntary, you may have to comply with substitute.
Right. 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 It's a voluntary thing, certainly. You know, one of the problems, you know, I think that I would always say for a town that thinks it will own the property forever is like, well, will things change? Will government change? Will they suddenly see a different use sometime in the future that they don't anticipate now, but maybe 20 years from now they do? So that's why a lot of folks participate, a lot of towns participate. But generally, there is often a public-private partnership for these brownfields, where the public side, you know, perhaps acquires the property, perhaps the taxes, something like that. There's a proposed reuse. They're working with a developer that wants to do X, Y, or Z with the property. They get as much money as they can as a public part to do as much of the work as possible, then hand it over. You know, the keys over to the private part. So where that transaction happens in the process is critical for money and where the money is going to come from and what type of money it will be, what type of funding. But it's always good, you know, to work closely with EPA and the DEP project managers on that and timing. So it's always great when everyone communicates on the sites. The places we've had the biggest problems are when people stop communicating. Right. Well, actually, when they run out of money, they don't stop communicating. They just call me and say, "Where can we get more money?" But VRAP protections run with the land. Successors and assigns are afforded the protections. That is, provided that they follow any conditions on the property. Typically, like I said, it comes with declaration of environmental covenants, deed restrictions. So that's a pretty common thing for these properties. Like I said, we try to make them no-brainers, so they're pretty easy for people to follow, even if they don't know it. Brownfields, the big question, is it right for you? So there are like 4 big factors you have to think about. Okay, what's the cost? Well, if it's brownfields and you have $1 million worth of cleanup costs, and you get brownfields to pay for all or most of that, it probably fits well. But with that cost, you know, comes the timing issue. It's going to take a little bit longer to go through the brownfields process because you're spending money that has strings attached, and you have to check certain boxes along the way. So it's good to have some planning not to say, hey, you know what? We've got someone that wants to come in 3 months. Might not work with Brownfields. We got someone that might come in 3 years. That's better. 1.5 years. I don't know. The more time you have, sometimes the better. Risk tolerance, that's a big thing. You know, I can't define what someone's risk tolerance is. You know, I've worked with many folks that come in as an applicant for VRAP, and they'll address some issues and they might not address the other issues. So they're not worried about it. They have that level of risk tolerance. Some people have a level where they're like, we don't want any risk at all. We want to take care of everything. Know everything. So yep. You have the ability to do that if you're not a responsible party. So someone purchasing the property coming in didn't cause any of the issues with the property. They want to clean up just part of it, put the blinders on, they can do that. We're going to encourage any cleanup we can get, obviously. We can get the whole thing, that's great. We love that, but we know that not everyone does that, and we know that people have different risk tolerance. You know? I mean, truthfully, there are some times when some issues at a site might be quite small potatoes. So I could understand saying, you know what, we're just not going to worry about that. But that happens. And ultimately, what's the benefit? You know, for the VRAP, where a lender's saying, hey, you need a VRAP, the benefit is getting that so you can get your loan, right? In other cases, you know, there may be other benefits, you know, that it gives you the comfort moving forward, you know, with purchasing and being part of a property, that we're not going to come along 3 years from now and knock you over the head, you know, with that sign off from the state. So there are certain benefits, and everyone's different. I try to understand, and I think the program tries to understand what an applicant, what people need from the process in the end. Because we could decide what we think it is, but that might not be it at all.
Well, that's a question. Let's say back to you.
Right.
Let's say there's nothing. But the state, if there's an appropriate phase 1, potential phase 2, where the state receives the information,
Yep. We have sites that are clean that participate in the program, you know, because what may happen is a bank may say, hey, you got to do your phase 1, right? And they go out and do it, and they find out, hey, there's nothing you can find anywhere that shows this ever had anything that we consider a source of information. At that point, we might write up a no further action assurance that basically says, you don't need to do any more assessment, or from what we say, any remediation. You're good. So, well, we have 2 certifications. The no further action assurance, the NFAA, is basically for sites where no cleanup is necessary. Sometimes sites where we just put deed restrictions on, and that is the remedy. Or we also have the certificate of completion, which is a site where they identify problems, they present a plan to address those problems, they implement that plan, they send us a final remediation report. We look at it and say, yep, did what you needed to do. That's when we apply that's when we issue a certification of completion. Both documents give you the same protections. They're just for different purposes, I guess, or different types of sites. No further action assurance. Yep, those get recorded with the deed, and then usually with those documents, if we have deed covenants, things that they need to continue to do at the property, that would get drafted in the form of a UECA, Uniform Environmental Covenants Act, and according to state statute, and that would be recorded as well. So the Brownfields process, the end results. Basically, it allows a municipality, a quasi-governmental organization, or a nonprofit to assess and clean up Brownfields properties. Private folks can also do that and get involved. Like I said, there's the public-private partnership in a lot of these. And private folks can get loans. You know, there's some brownfields loans available out there from the state and the ECD. You have to go through the whole brownfields process and still check all those boxes, but they can get a loan. And, you know, right now the terms are pretty darn good, right? You know, the loan rate for most folks is pretty high. It's pretty low for ours. We want to get the money out there and get sites cleaned up. So the terms are pretty favorable. And no one else is going to give you money, $1 million to clean up a bunch of dirty dirt before you can start building. So, you know, it's a good program. Can help fulfill a community vision and or return properties to the tax rolls. That's a big consideration for us, you know. That sometimes communities, you know, it's not all about doing this for business. You know, I've had plenty of places do it for green space or things like that people needed, boat ramps, all kinds of stuff, waterfront access. Provide incentives for investment in the community. So a lot of times you do one brownfield site, kind of clean up a spot that looked pretty ugly and had contaminant issues, and folks around it start investing in the area. So that's a big part of what we want to see. Property values before and after. Well, you know, before unknown cost to remediate. So who wants to buy a property for $250,000 when you don't know how much it's going to cost to clean it up? Unknown liability. You know, what are the problems there? What am I going to have to deal with? After, you know, you've identified the issues and addressed them, and the ongoing responsibilities of property owner are clarified. That's with the covenants. You know, what do you need to do? Well, put in a well. You know, don't use it for residential purposes. And when we put in, generally, when we put in deed restrictions on a property, we don't see them as necessarily forever. We are open to other uses and other, you know, renegotiating parts of that as appropriate. It may mean someone may need to do additional work, but we're not opposed to that. So some deed restrictions will say it's going to be this way for always and forever. We don't do that in Maine generally. We like to keep them flexible for the long term. So here's just a couple examples that we have around the state. This is the Mill District down in Biddeford, Saco. Biddeford is now the youngest community in the state of Maine, according to the most recent census. And it's in part, really in a large part, due to the mill development. There are all kinds of relatively affordable, nice apartments on the river, these old mill buildings, which are pretty cool. They all have lots of retail in the bottom floors. I don't know if you've been down to any of those mills, Pepperell Mill, et cetera. They're awesome. They built in, you see that one photo on there, the one that's kind of in the middle, furthest to the right, is that is a kind of amphitheater structure they put in with hardscape. So it's all granite and stuff like that. And so it's a kind of a community park area to have events. The cool thing about it is, you know, the Saco River floods every year, sometimes more than others. Water comes up in there because it's hardscape. It really doesn't do anything to it. So that's part of that climate resiliency thing. Brewer Public Works and Brewer. This is one of those cases where, guess what? Brewer wanted to do it. They were grantee. They had money for assessment. Brewer wanted to do an assessment on this. We said, you can't. You owned it. It was Brewer Public Works. You made the mess. We did the assessment with our money in the state as a different entity. Got the assessment done. They had problems. They got them cleaned up. And now it's Mason's Brewing. My joke is that you know, most brownfields end up being breweries. And I don't know, maybe now the new paradigm is most brownfields end up being breweries or weed distributors. So I don't know. But right. So but that was a case where, you know, we found a different way to fund the work because they were not an eligible entity. Children's Museum and Theater of Maine in Portland, that's down in Thompson's Point, beautiful new facility. They had a lot of dirty dirt there for years of industrial uses, including railroad yard. They coupled all kinds of funding sources together to get it cleaned up, which was pretty cool and unique. The because I think they got funding, certainly got funding from state DECD, from our Brownfields program to do parts of the assessment. They kind of parceled out the property some, different areas, they're developing it. They're assessing it, cleaning it up and developing it as they go. They received funding from GP-COG and from the city of Portland. I think there were 4 different remedial pockets of money that came out of it to get that work done. So pretty interesting when you pull all those things together. Belfast Soup Kitchen down in Belfast, they were looking for a new place. This was an old gas station, service garage. Still had the tanks in the ground, even though the gas station was gone for a long time. We came out and pulled the tanks, some work with some of our money. They were loaned some money additionally that they needed to take care of some of the issues there. You know, and now it's servicing the community need. They needed a soup kitchen, and we got a nice new soup kitchen down there now. So we had money in that. So we don't care who we partner with as long as it's a good, viable project. And the better someone can define what the end use is, what their project is, the easier it is for us to buy into it and put money into it. The worst thing that can happen is you have a brownfield site and all that you get at the end of the day is reports. Nothing ever happens. EPA doesn't like that because it's really hard to put a ribbon on that. You know, they want to see something where they have success. They're putting out a lot of money, and that's what they want to see. What? Right, right. The good thing about a lot of this work, truthfully, though, is that you will have a site and you say, "Oh, I'm sorry, but this is a dog site," right? It's just not going anywhere or anything. And it will sit there. Those reports will sit there 5, 7 years, and suddenly someone does something. You know, so sometimes the end game, it might be a long ways off, but that's always good too. It's always good when you can quantify what the issues are at a property. So someone can then, if they're interested in something for that property, say, well, here are the problems. You know, we know what they are. We know what it will take to fix them. So and that's it. You know, like I said, Chris has now taken over the program. He took it over a couple months ago, or just recently, actually. I was doing 2 jobs for a while. You know, he's a good person to contact. He's very knowledgeable about this. He worked in the program for quite a few years. He knows a lot about the program. You know, we continue to look for good sites and ways that we can help communities. So don't be afraid to reach out to Chris and, you know, see how he might be able to help.
So looking at the clock and seeing it's about 5 to 2, are there any questions either in here or on Zoom that people have for Nick while he's still here? Not all at once, people. With the bipartisan infrastructure law funds, is there any additional funding for brownfields to help with cleanup or any other sources that you might suggest to some towns?
There aren't really additional grants in name, you know, but there's a lot more money grants. You know, it used to be you got an assessment grant for use in the community. It was 200,000. Now I think the ceiling is like 500,000. You can do a lot of individual site-specific stuff, which is much higher numbers. The brownfields revolving loan funds, are much larger than they used to be. So there's a lot more money, basically, and that's why during this time where we anticipate another 4 years of pretty high funding, if it all comes to fruition, we're really encouraging people to find those brownfields and get them in and get them in process. You know, I've been having projects for years that we've kind of been sitting on, or that the folks involved have kind of been sitting on because we couldn't come up with the money to do it. This is the time. You know, we're taking on some big sites in Lincoln and Millinocket, places around the state that before we're like, okay, we can get 200,000, but we get $1 million problem. You know, how do you make up that difference? It's a lot easier right now. The bill money also doesn't have match to it. So we used to have 20% match on a lot of these cleanup grants. We don't have that now. So there are a lot of advantages to getting in now. If the community has identified something they really want to look at, assess, clean up, move on to that next phase of development. This is a really good time to be aggressive and do that. And there are a lot of folks that will help. There are certain environmental justice, for one, is a big focus of this administration. And hiring contractors, yeah. I mean, we try to encourage, and the grants want you to encourage. You have basically the states establish for the grants the meaty-weedy, as we call it. And they establish what percentage of their funding will go to minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, disadvantaged businesses, is generally called now. We don't have a problem meeting that because one of our big labs is women-owned. We have a number of Brownfields contractors that are women, so it's easy for us to meet it. We'll meet that in just a couple sites. But right. Yeah. So if we get $1 million and we have to have X amount of that percentage, of the disadvantaged businesses, we have to meet that. So some sites will have it, some sites we don't. Absolutely. Thank you. If you have more questions after this, you can contact Chris. You can contact me. I will never be entirely out of the program.
All right. Well, if there's no other questions, Nick, I know you got a road to Augusta you need to get to.
Right.
I want to thank the city of Rockland for hosting this here. I want to thank everyone who was able to attend today, and either in person or online, and we'll be watching this later on. We'll have it on the YouTube channel for anyone who wants to come back to this.
Great. Thanks for having me. Thank you all.